Welcome, brave travelers of the dark and curious. Tonight we step into the thin air of the Himalayas, where the wind itself whispers old secrets and the mountains watch with cold, unblinking eyes. You have arrived at a place few dare to climb, and even fewer dare to understand. This is no ordinary valley, no forgotten trail, no simple patch of wilderness carved by time. What waits for us in this chapter is a lake, small, shallow, silent, and yet filled with a terror that has baffled explorers, scientists, and spiritual seekers for nearly 1,000 years. A lake where the dead sleep without peace. A lake that freezes in winter but cannot bury its sins. A lake that reveals its horrors only to those foolish enough or brave enough to stand at its edge. Welcome to Skeleton Lake, also known as Roopkund, one of the world's most chilling archaeological mysteries. A place where hundreds of skeletons lie scattered around the water like abandoned marionettes, their empty eye sockets staring forever upward at a sky that once betrayed them. Their bones tell a story no one alive witnessed, and yet everyone who visits feels in their blood something catastrophic happened here, something sudden, something violent, something that should not have happened at all. If you enjoy chilling mysteries, hidden history, and journeys into the unknown, then you're in the right place. By the end of this chapter, if you find yourself intrigued, perhaps even unsettled, don't forget to subscribe for more. Stories like this should never be heard alone. Now, let us begin. High in the mountains of Uttarakhand, at an altitude where the air feels thin enough to slice, where even strong climbers stop to catch their breath, lies a bowl-shaped valley surrounded by towering cliffs. The path to Roopkund is not an easy one. It winds through dense forests echoing with bird calls, across meadows so green they appear painted, and over narrow ridges where one misstep could send a traveler tumbling into oblivion. For pilgrims on the ancient Rajjot Yatra route, the journey is sacred, exhausting, and deeply symbolic. But for the unprepared traveler, someone with no knowledge of the mountain's moods, it is a place where the line between awe and fear dissolves like mist. And it is here, at around 16,500 feet above sea level, that the lake sits. From a distance, Roopkund is almost unremarkable, more like a large puddle trapped by stone and ice than a true lake. But as one approaches, something shifts. The silence becomes heavier. The temperature seems to drop. Even the wind, so fierce and sharp at that altitude, changes tone. It becomes thinner, quieter, as if the air itself is holding its breath. Then, when the lake is free of its winter ice, something catches the eye. A pale curve beneath the water, a white shape resting in the mud, another beside it, and another, and then dozens more.
Bones. Human bones. The first recorded modern encounter with this macabre sight came in the early 1940s, when a group of British forest rangers stumbled upon the lake during a routine inspection of the region. Imagine their shock as they walked closer, expecting perhaps a small herd of dead animals, only to discover human skulls with fractures spider-webbing across their surfaces. Femurs, ribs, vertebrae, scattered as if a great hand had tossed them carelessly. Skulls with cracks so perfectly round that they looked like the marks of some ancient weapon. The rangers, hardened men accustomed to wild environments, felt a fear they could not explain. There was no sign of a battle, no weapons, no belongings that indicated an army had perished there. The bodies had not been buried, they had not been arranged with care. They lay where they fell, and, untouched by scavengers, preserved by the cold. It was as if the lake itself had guarded them across centuries, refusing to let them turn to dust. But long before the British found the bones, long before scientists came with their tools and their theories, the locals already knew the lake's dark reputation. They avoided Roopkund whenever they could. They whispered of curses, of wrathful goddesses, of ancient processions that never returned. They said no one should linger there unless they wished to join the dead. To the villagers who lived below the valleys, Roopkund was not a place for the living, it was a place for endings. The British administrators at the time considered the bodies a potential military concern. They suspected a secret massacre, perhaps Japanese soldiers during World War II, lost and frozen in the Himalayas. But that theory collapsed almost immediately. These were not recent bodies. Their bones were old, very old. Clothes found near the lake were made of wool and leather, woven in patterns not used for centuries. Some skulls were nearly fossilized by the cold. In their uncertainty, the officers sought help from anthropologists, who arrived with rulers, brushes, notebooks, and minds eager to solve the riddle. But the more they studied, the more the mystery deepened. Each skeleton seemed slightly different. Some were quite tall, others short. Some belonged to young adults, others to older men and women. This was not a single group, it was not a family, it was not an army. It was something else entirely. And then there were the skull injuries, round, deep depressions on the top of the heads, as though smashed by blunt objects falling vertically with tremendous force. Yet there were no cuts, no sword marks, no signs of animal attack. Whatever killed them had done so quickly, violently, and without mercy. News of the Lake of Bones spread across India and then beyond, intriguing scholars and terrifying locals. But for decades, no one could offer a satisfying explanation. Every time a theory gained popularity, new evidence emerged that pulled it apart. It was a place where reason faltered, where facts refused to fit neatly into boxes. Still, the mountain kept its secrets.
The pilgrims who passed by during the Rajjat Yatra continued their rituals, singing ancient hymns and gripping their offerings tightly as they walked past the cursed lake. Some claimed that on stormy days, echoes of screams rose with the wind. Others said they saw figures, shadows in the fog, moving around the lake's edge only to vanish when called out to. Many refused to look directly at the water, afraid that locking eyes with the dead would invite disaster. Roopkund became a story told in hushed voices, a place that punished arrogance and swallowed trust. Even today, seasoned climbers describe a sensation upon arrival, a sense that they are being watched by something older than memory. The lake does not welcome, it waits. The higher you climb, the deeper the mystery becomes, and as we descend chapter by chapter into the heart of this haunting tale, we will uncover truths that science alone cannot hold. Because the dead of Roopkund do not merely lie in the open, they speak, through the scars on their bones, through the artifacts they left behind, through the frozen stillness that refuses to let their story fade. Why did hundreds of people from different times, different places, and different origins die at the same small lake? What force struck them down so violently that their bones cracked beneath the blow? And why does the lake continue to reveal more bodies each time the ice melts? These are the questions that have troubled minds for decades, and in the chapters ahead we will piece together the answers, one layer at a time, digging through myth, legend, climate science, DNA research, and the eerie empathy we feel for those who died in a place so isolated that even today few dare to approach it. For now, let your imaginations settle beside the lake. Let your eyes wander across the white arcs of bone, illuminated by pale mountain sunlight. Let your breath mingle with the cold mist rising from the water. Listen closely. The mountains whisper. The wind remembers. And the lake, silent and small though it may be, holds a story carved not in words, but in broken skeletons. A story we are only beginning to uncover.
The year was 1942, and the world was engulfed in the darkest flames of war. Armies marched across continents, navies clashed in distant seas, and the Himalayas, ancient, aloof, and towering above all human conflict, stood untouched by the madness below. Yet even here, in a place the world assumed was beyond the reach of chaos, something was stirring. Clouds drifted low, casting ethereal shadows across the valleys, while the wind carried the sound of boots crunching rhythmically over frost-bitten soil. A British patrol was moving through this remote region of Uttarakhand, surveying the high mountain trails for any sign of enemy movement. Rumors had circulated that Japanese soldiers might attempt to cross into India through Nepal or the northern passes, and so the patrol climbed. Imagine their exhaustion as they trekked through thinning air, layered in thick woolen uniforms, their breath forming small, ghostly clouds that dispersed quickly in the cold. These were soldiers accustomed to danger, but nothing in their training had prepared them for what they were about to find. The patrol commander, Captain John Lethbridge, noted in his journal that the Himalayan silence unnerved him more than distant gunfire. The mountains, he wrote, made him feel observed by something that belonged to no man. As the patrol advanced toward a depression in the landscape, a basin surrounded by ridges, they expected only to find a patch of snow or a glacial meltwater pool. But the first soldier to reach the slope halted so abruptly that the man behind him nearly collided with him. The soldier raised a hand, pointing wordlessly toward the lake. Captain Lethbridge stepped forward, squinting against the sun's glare reflecting off ice. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then the glint of sunlight struck something pale beneath the melting surface, something round, something unmistakable. A skull. The captain descended toward the lake with caution, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. The ice was thinning by the hour, giving way to patches of black water that swallowed the light. As he approached the edge, he saw not one skull, but several, some submerged, some resting in the shallow margins like relics laid out for judgment. Long bones littered the ground, ribs curled like brittle shells. Leg bones protruded from thin layers of melting ice. Nearby, a half-frozen hand reached upward, fingers curled mid-grasp, as though clawing at the air in a final desperate plea. The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. War had hardened them to death, but this was different. These were not the casualties of battle. These were the remnants of something older, something inexplicable, something that felt wrong to disturb. Captain Lethbridge crouched beside a skull, brushing away frost with gloved hands. The bone was cracked, deep, round, almost perfectly circular. Not like a fracture from a fall, not like a wound from a blade. It looked as though the skull had been struck by a heavy, blunt object falling straight downward. He could not make sense of it. The patrol, now tense and silent, began to spread around the lake's perimeter. More bones, more skulls, more signs that something catastrophic had unfolded here long before any of them were born. The soldiers whispered theories: a massacre, a mass grave, victims of a forgotten battle, perhaps a secret burial ground used by a hidden tribe. But the uniformed placement of injuries made no sense, nor did the absence of weapons or signs of struggle. When the soldiers radioed the discovery to regional authorities, the first reaction was suspicion. India was, after all, in the throes of war. Had an enemy battalion been ambushed and buried by snow? Had a lost patrol met its end? But the sheer number of bodies, dozens, then hundreds, made the possibility improbable. How could so many soldiers die in the same place, at the same time, without any record? As news spread through the colonial administration, officials debated what to do. Some argued that the bodies should be retrieved and buried. Others insisted on investigation before any action. A handful even suggested burning the remains to prevent the spread of disease, but this idea was quickly discarded. The cold had preserved the bones too perfectly for them to be recent. So, in late summer, when the snow melted enough to permit a clearer survey, a small team of anthropologists and medical examiners arrived. Their journey was almost as grueling as the soldiers. Narrow trails, sudden drops, unpredictable storms. When they finally reached Roopkund, the sight captivated them. The lake had melted further, revealing more of the skeletal chaos beneath the water's surface.
The scientists set up camp on a nearby flat patch of ground, erected canvas tents that flapped in the biting wind, and spent their first night unable to sleep. The air was filled with a silence so profound that even their own heartbeat felt intrusive. From the direction of the lake, they could hear ice cracking faintly, sharp, brittle snaps echoing like distant footsteps. The next morning, they began their work. They measured bone lengths, noted variations in skull shape, cataloged items found among the remains, wooden staffs, iron rings, leather slippers hardened by time. The artifacts were clearly old, but how old? Some bore stitching patterns reminiscent of medieval Indian craftsmanship, while others seemed foreign, unfamiliar even to experts. But the most disturbing discovery remained the skull fractures. Almost every skeleton bore them, deep dents on the crown of the head. It was as though the victims had been caught in a violent storm of fists made of stone. They died instantly or nearly so, collapsing where they stood. The vertical nature of the wounds baffled the scientists. Mass suicide? Unlikely. Weapons? None present. Animals? Impossible. No predator strikes like that. And then another revelation. The skeletons were not grouped together as one might expect from a mass burial. They were scattered across the landscape, as though each body had fallen independently. Some collapsed near the lake. Others lay farther up the slope. The distribution suggested panic, chaos, a sudden catastrophe that left no time for escape. At night, as the wind howled between the peaks, the researchers sat around a modest fire, debating possibilities. Their discussions carried a tremor of awe and fear. They knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that challenged assumptions about the region's history. The locals, meanwhile, refused to come near the lake. Even when asked to assist the expedition, many declined, whispering that the mountain goddess, Nanda Devi, punished trespassers who approached her sacred realm without reverence. They spoke of a long-ago queen whose vanity angered the goddess, causing a storm that slaughtered her entourage. The anthropologists dismissed these tales as folklore, but they could not deny the eerie similarity between the story and the injuries on the bones. As days passed, the team uncovered more evidence: fragments of jewelry, pieces of clothing, a few wooden vessels that had somehow resisted centuries of decay. Some items appeared ceremonial, suggesting the victims might have been pilgrims. But why would a pilgrimage route lead through such treacherous terrain? Why would anyone bring women, children, and the elderly individuals to such a high altitude?
Then came the most unsettling clue. The skeletons seemed to belong to different time periods. Subtle differences in bone wear, artifact age, and burial depth hinted that the dead were not from a single tragic event. The mountain had claimed multiple groups, or perhaps a single group composed of people of varying backgrounds and ages. The more the scientists learned, the less they understood. When they finally descended the mountain weeks later, they carried with them boxes of bones, carefully wrapped in cloth, each tagged and cataloged. They carried also a set of questions that would haunt researchers for decades. What killed these people? How many died? Why did they come here? And why did the lake preserve them so perfectly? The British administration, overwhelmed with wartime demands, soon lost interest in the remote mystery. The bones were sent to various institutions, some stored, some analyzed, some forgotten. The world had more immediate horrors to attend to. Yet Roopkund did not forget. Each summer, when the ice thinned, new bones emerged, silently reminding the living that the dead were still waiting for answers. Locals avoided the lake even more fervently, convinced that disturbing the remains invited misfortune. Pilgrims walked past with solemn hearts, murmuring prayers not only for themselves, but for the nameless souls trapped in the cold earth. And as decades passed, the mystery deepened. The lake stood still, a dark mirror reflecting both clouds and questions. The path that led to it remained steep and treacherous. The stories that surrounded it grew in number and intensity. Slight shifts in climate revealed more bones. Tourists stumbled upon remains with equal parts fascination and horror. It would take another 60 years and breakthroughs in DNA science to begin unraveling the truth. But that revelation belonged to the future. For now, the mountain remained the only witness. The wind carried whispers that no one could decipher. And the lake, still and frigid, held its secret beneath a thin sheet of ice that threatened to shatter at the slightest touch. Roopkund had been discovered, but its mysteries had only just awakened.
Long before the British soldiers stumbled upon Roopkund, long before anthropologists debated over fractured skulls and scattered bones, the people living in the foothills of the Himalayas already knew the mountain held secrets. They had grown up beneath its looming shadow, watching the way clouds curled around its slopes like white serpents, how winds descended suddenly as if the gods themselves exhaled through the peaks. To outsiders, these were only weather patterns. But to the villagers who lived at the mercy of the mountains, such signs were warnings, gentle reminders that some places were not meant to be questioned. In these villages, tucked between terraced fields and sloping pine forests, the story of Roopkund was older than memory, older than the houses, older even than the winding trails that pilgrims followed. According to the elders, the lake had always been a place where the veil between the living and the dead hung dangerously thin. Children were told not to climb too far, not to wander off the path, not to look too long at the distant ridges where the snow gleamed like bone. Not because they might get lost, but because the mountain watched, and the mountain remembered. In the evenings, when the fire crackled in the courtyard and families gathered under the stars, the elders spoke in tones so low they were almost whispers. They told of the Rajjat Yatra, the most sacred pilgrimage of the region, one that took place only once every 12 years. This was no ordinary journey, no simple walk through the hills. It was an odyssey, a procession of men, women, priests, dancers, shepherds, and musicians, all traveling together as a human river of devotion toward the distant home of Goddess Nanda Devi. For generations, the villagers carried the goddess's palanquin across forests, meadows, and steep ridges, reenacting ancient legends with every step. The pilgrimage passed near Roopkund, though never directly beside it. Even in the most sacred procession, the lake was avoided, like a sleeping beast whose slumber should not be disturbed. But the pilgrims always felt its presence, an icy pull in the air, a sudden silence in the forest, the way birds avoided circling the valley. It was a place to hurry past, offering silent prayers without looking too closely. According to legend, the lake had earned its ominous reputation many centuries ago, during the time of King Jashdawal of Kannauj. He was said to be proud, wealthy, and immensely devoted to his queen, a woman of striking beauty. When the queen became pregnant, the king insisted on undertaking the Rajjat Yatra as a gesture of gratitude to Nanda Devi. But against warnings from priests and villagers, he brought with him a massive entourage, dancers, musicians, servants, even courtiers and wealthy friends. It was meant to be a celebration, a jubilant parade honoring both the goddess and the queen's future child.
But this festival-like procession angered Nanda Devi, for the pilgrimage was meant to be solemn, humble, free from pride and extravagance. And so, as the legend recounts, when the king's entourage reached the slopes near Roopkund, the goddess unleashed her fury. The storm came without warning, a roar of thunder that split the sky, lightning that danced along the ridges, and hailstones the size of iron balls that rained down with deadly force. The dancers were the first to fall, their ornate costumes shredded by ice. The musicians dropped next, their drums silenced forever. The queen, terrified and shielding her unborn child, collapsed on the icy ground. The king, helpless and horrified, watched as his entire entourage was crushed by the unrelenting hail. Not one person survived. The villagers claimed that their skeletons remained there as a reminder of the goddess's wrath. As the elders recited this tale, the children listened with wide, fearful eyes. Some would glance toward the distant mountains, wondering if the storm clouds gathering at dusk were signs of the goddess stirring again. The adults spoke the story with reverence, not to frighten the young, but to teach them a simple truth. Pride had no place in the mountains. But behind the myth, deeper echoes stirred. The villagers also spoke of strange sounds near Roopkund. Distant drumming on nights when thunderclouds gathered, the faint clinking of anklets, even though no dancers walked the ridges, and shadows flickering briefly on slopes empty of human presence. Shepherds returning late from high pastures sometimes claimed to see figures standing by the lake, pale and motionless, only to vanish when approached. Others told of travelers who had passed too close to Roopkund during unseasonable storms and returned changed. They spoke little, walked with stiff limbs, and woke screaming from dreams of 1,000 hands reaching upward from beneath the lake's surface. One shepherd recalled seeing a woman in white standing on a snowy ridge above the lake, her hair blowing wildly in the wind, her face hidden behind a veil. When he blinked, she was gone. Still, even these stories could not explain everything.
Some village elders hinted at something even older, legends passed down from ancestors who lived long before the Rajjat Yatra existed. They spoke of wanderers from faraway lands who crossed into the mountains in search of sacred waters. They spoke of foreign pilgrims and traders who never returned, swallowed by a storm that left no survivors. These tales, though rarely discussed, suggested that Roopkund's curse was far older than the story of the king and his queen. Over time, the legends blended together, adorned, reshaped, passed from one generation to the next. The past grew soft at the edges, forming a mixture of myth and memory. But all stories shared one unwavering truth. No one died peacefully at Roopkund. The mountain demanded a price, and those bones scattered beside the lake were offerings the mountain had claimed. When the British discovery was reported in the villages, the elders were unsurprised. They had always known the lake held the dead. But what startled them was the sheer number. Hundreds more than any oral story mentioned, and many skeletons showed signs that they did not belong to a royal entourage or local pilgrims. Their bones were shaped differently, their height unusual, their jewelry foreign. This revelation disturbed the elders deeply. If the dead of Roopkund were not only their ancestors or the ill-fated entourage of the proud king, then who were they?
What other stories had been lost to time? What truths had the mountain kept hidden behind its icy veil? As visitors grew curious and attempted to climb toward the lake, villagers warned them, sometimes gently, sometimes fiercely. They told them that the mountain was alive with memory, that the lake saw the intentions of those who approached. They believed that anyone who journeyed to Roopkund uninvited risked becoming part of its eternal silence. Yet the whispers persisted. Scholars wanted answers, adventurers wanted proof, and the mountain, patient as only ancient stone can be, waited for the day when someone with the right tools and curiosity would arrive. Someone bold enough to dig beneath the legends, someone willing to interpret the whispers that had echoed for centuries across the wind. The past was stirring. The stories that had lain dormant in the bones of Roopkund were awakening. And as people began to ask questions that had been buried for generations, the line between folklore and history began to blur. In those high slopes where snow glistened like ivory and the lake reflected the sky with eerie perfection, the dead listened. They had waited long enough.
The wind howls differently at Roopkund. Those who have stood near the lake claim that unlike the crisp, sharp winds that sweep across most of the Himalayas, the gusts around the lake seem to circle, to linger, to whisper, as though they are trying to speak. Some say the wind carries memories. Others say it carries warnings. In the generations following the legend of the doomed royal entourage, the story of Roopkund evolved into something more than folklore. It became a force, an invisible boundary that shaped the way people understood the mountains. The villagers did not need scientific proof or archaeological evidence. They had seen enough storms to know that the Himalayas did not forgive arrogance. And so the story of the queen, the dancers, and the wrath of Nanda Devi became more than a tale of divine punishment. It became a template through which all danger was interpreted. But the curse, as the villagers understood it, was not just about the sins of the king. It was about the mountain itself, its moods, its laws, its unspoken expectations. When outsiders came asking questions after the British discovery, the villagers did not eagerly recount the legend to entertain them. Instead, they spoke carefully, measuring their words like offerings. They believed that even telling the story carried a certain risk, as if invoking the lake could summon its attention. Still, the tale traveled. From villages to towns, from towns to cities, until eventually it reached the ears of scholars far from the Himalayas. The story seemed almost too dramatic to be anything but myth. A proud king angering a goddess, a procession of hundreds killed in a sudden storm, bodies left scattered across a frozen lake. Yet the similarities between the legend and the injuries on the skulls found at Roopkund were difficult to ignore.
The queen. According to the story, she had been pregnant during the pilgrimage. Toward the end of the journey, as the entourage climbed toward the sacred lake, she grew restless. Her cravings, intensified by her pregnancy, drove her to demand forbidden luxuries, songs, dances, and elaborate rituals of celebration. The king, eager to please her, allowed all of it, ignoring the warnings of priests who insisted that the pilgrimage was meant to be humble. It was said that the queen stepped into the sacred grounds with silver anklets that jingled with every step. The goddess, hearing this ostentatious sound in a place meant for quiet reverence, became enraged. Some versions of the story claim the queen even spilled milk or trampled a sacred flower, an unforgivable insult to the deity. Others said she danced and laughed too loudly, disturbing the solemn energy of the mountain. Whatever the cause, the result was always the same. The goddess unleashed the storm.
And in every telling, the queen's death was the centerpiece, not because she was royal, but because her downfall symbolized a breach of spiritual order. The mountain demanded balance, and those who disrupted it faced the consequences. When modern researchers first heard these details, they dismissed them as embellishments. But when they studied the bones and found several belonging to women of high status based on jewelry and clothing fragments, they paused. Was it possible that the legend was based on a real event? Could it be that the storm had indeed killed a group of travelers whose misfortune later became moralized into a divine punishment story? It was an enticing possibility, but the curse had grown beyond its origin. As more scholars came, the villagers' stories became more vivid. Some spoke of nights when lights flickered across the lake's surface, as though spirits wandered, searching for their lost companions. Others described hearing prying or whispers carried by the wind. Shepherds who passed near the lake swore that when mist rolled in thickly, they sometimes saw figures standing at the edge, motionless, silent, watching. One shepherd, an elderly man whose face was etched by decades of wind and snow, recalled climbing near the lake in his youth. He said, "I felt someone behind me. Not a person, not an animal, something cold, something that wanted me to leave." When asked what happened next, he shrugged. "I listened." Some climbers in later years described similar experiences. They would reach the final ascent to Roopkund and suddenly feel the inexplicable urge to turn back. Others said they felt sick, lightheaded, or overwhelmed with dread. Not the altitude, but something deeper, something that seemed to push them away from the lake.
Scientists attributed this to altitude sickness. Locals whispered that it was the curse. As the decades passed, the idea of divine wrath became inseparable from Roopkund's identity. Even those who did not believe in gods spoke of a presence, an energy that made the place feel alive. A few attempted to climb the surrounding cliffs to gain a better view of the lake, but the mountain proved unforgiving. Loose stones gave way, footing vanished. Climbers slipped or turned back in fear. The cliffs surrounding Roopkund seemed intentionally angled to trap the dead and repel the living. One of the more unsettling parts of the local lore was the belief that the mountain kept count. According to some elders, the lake demanded life every few decades, as if maintaining a balance known only to the earth itself. When someone died near Roopkund, which happened on rare occasions, villagers lamented not just the loss, but the fulfillment of an ancient rhythm. Despite all this, the story of the curse was not one of simple fear. It was a story woven with reverence. The mountain, they said, was not evil. It was sacred. The dead were not condemned souls. They were guardians, sentinels locked in a perpetual watch over a place where heaven and earth met. For villagers, the curse of Roopkund was not a punishment, but a reminder. A reminder that humans, no matter their wealth or pride, remained small, fragile figures moving across a world of stone and storm. Yet, as compelling as the legend was, it was only half the story. The skeletons themselves hinted at something far stranger than myth. Differences in bone structure, variations in age and heritage, artifacts belonging to people who should not have been traveling together. The curse may have explained one group, but what of the others? Why were bodies spanning centuries lying in the same valley? Why had no one ever recorded such a catastrophic event? Why did the mountain preserve these bones so meticulously?
As the researchers packed their notes and prepared to leave, they felt the weight of these unanswered questions. They had come seeking evidence, but had found instead a labyrinth of possibilities. The legend of the curse, once dismissed as folklore, now felt like a doorway to truths that had not yet been uncovered. The curse of Roopkund had shaped the fears of villagers for centuries, but it was about to shape science as well. For the first time, scholars began to suspect that the mystery was not just local, it was global. The past was no longer just echoing, it was calling out, and the world was finally listening.
The discovery of the bones, unsettling as it was, did not provide answers. It offered only questions, questions that grew heavier as more researchers reached Roopkund in the years following the British patrol. By the 1950s and 60s, the mystery had captured the curiosity of scientists across India. They arrived with new tools, fresh hypotheses, and an eagerness to untangle the enigma of a lake that harbored the dead like a silent crypt. But the path to Roopkund was as treacherous as the questions it raised. Every team that attempted the climb faced the mountain's mercurial temperament. Storms erupted without warning. Fog swallowed trails that had been clear just moments earlier. The air grew thin, making every step feel like walking through a memory of weightlessness. The mountain had a way of reminding them that knowledge came at a cost. Still, the researchers pressed on. They reached the lake during the brief window in summer when the ice melted enough to reveal its secrets. And once again, the bones greeted them, bleached by the sun, polished by time, and scattered like mournful offerings around the lake's perimeter. The sight was so surreal that even seasoned anthropologists found themselves pausing in stunned silence before beginning their work. The scientists cataloged skulls, femurs, ribs, and fragments of clothing. They documented the distribution of bodies, mapping the outline of a tragedy frozen in time. Many of the skeletons were so well preserved that the researchers could still see hair clinging to skulls or fragments of skin mummified by the thin air. One skeleton lay sprawled near a rock with its fingers curled into the soil, suggesting its owner had struggled desperately in their final moments. Another was found lying face down, arms outstretched as if reaching for the sky or pleading for mercy from an unseen force. But the most disturbing detail, the one that confounded the researchers and haunted their discussions, was the uniformity of the injuries. Almost every skull bore a round depression, a precise, powerful blow delivered from directly above. It looked as though each person had been struck by a hammer, a club, or an object with enormous force. Yet there were no weapons. There were no signs of warfare, no arrows, no blades, no broken shields or spears. These people had not been killed in battle. They had been killed by the sky. The researchers took detailed photographs and measurements. They compared the fracture patterns on the skulls, noting how similar they were despite the different ages and sexes of the victims. A child's skull bore the same type of dent as that of a tall adult man. The force that had killed them had not discriminated.
As they examined the bodies, they found no signs of defensive wounds, no broken arms raised in futile attempts to shield their heads. Many skeletons were found lying in positions that suggested sudden collapse. Knees buckled, hands clenched, spines twisted as if the victims fell where they stood. Whatever struck them had struck quickly and without warning. The team theorized that the cause might have been a mass landslide or falling rocks. After all, the cliffs surrounding the lake were steep and jagged. Perhaps a rockfall had collapsed on a group of travelers, crushing them with brutal efficiency. But the fractures on the skulls did not match the irregular impacts of falling rock. They were too tidy, too round, too consistent. Nature's blows were chaotic. These were deliberate. Another theory emerged.
an outbreak of disease. Maybe the skeletons belonged to plague victims abandoned by their companions. But this idea fell apart quickly. Disease did not crack skulls, and disease did not explain why so many died at exactly the same moment. Slowly, reluctantly, the researchers began to circle back to the legend. Hailstones. Not the small pellets familiar to monsoon storms in the lowlands, but monstrous spheres of ice, large enough to crush bone, hurled downward with deadly speed. At first, the idea seemed absurd. Hail could not possibly be large enough to kill dozens, hundreds of people. But as the researchers studied weather patterns and spoke to meteorologists, they learned that in the Himalayas, freak storms were possible. The altitude could create conditions that amplified hail formation. In rare cases, hailstones the size of cricket balls or even larger could form and fall with terminal velocity. But to kill so many people? To strike each one with such precision? The coincidence felt almost unnatural. And then, the researchers found something that deepened the mystery even further. The bodies were not all from the same era. Some skeletons showed signs of belonging to the 9th century, others to the 12th century, and still others seemed far younger, potentially from the 17th or 18th centuries. It was as if Roopkund had become a magnet for death, drawing in different groups across centuries and claiming them with similar brutality. How was that possible?
Had multiple storms struck the same spot across generations? Had the lake been a perilous site known to only a few, its dangers whispered in hushed warnings that newcomers ignored? And why had so many people, men, women, elderly, and children, traveled across one of the most unforgiving terrains in the world? The researchers found fragments of wooden staffs intricately carved, leather sandals with stitching patterns unseen in modern footwear, iron rings, bracelets, and beads, cloth dyed in vivid colors that had miraculously survived centuries of cold. These details suggested that the victims had not been part of a military expedition. They were travelers, pilgrims, or wanderers. Their belongings reflected status, purpose, culture, a life interrupted. One of the scientists, Dr. Subramanian, wrote in his field notes, "It is as though the mountain is a gatekeeper, and those who approach without permission are struck down. There is a pattern here, but not one of human design. Something ancient, something elemental has shaped this place." As the team descended the mountain after weeks of collecting data, each researcher carried a weight heavier than their pack. They had uncovered clues, but the truth remained elusive, shimmering just beyond reach. The bones told a story, but one spoken in a language no one yet understood. The legend of Nanda Devi's wrath suddenly seemed less like superstition and more like an echo of something real, something the villagers had witnessed or sensed long before science found the bones. Yet even that was not the whole truth, because hidden within the skulls, within the teeth and marrow, within the brittle remains preserved by the cold, were secrets waiting to be revealed by technologies the 20th century had not yet perfected. Secrets that would eventually rewrite everything researchers believed about Roopkund. As the scientists trekked back down the mountain, the wind intensified around the lake. The ripples on its surface erased their footprints. Fog rolled in from the cliffs, draping the basin in an eerie white shroud. Roopkund, silent and watchful, reclaimed its solitude. The dead waited, and the storm that had killed them, whether mythic or meteorological, left behind not just bones, but a promise. The answers would not be simple.
For decades, Roopkund remained a haunting riddle. The early expeditions had identified the bones, catalogued their injuries, documented the eerie uniformity of their deaths,
Yet the truth of who these people were remained buried beneath centuries of silence. The researchers returned home with sketches, photographs, and notes while the mountain reclaimed its quiet, watching over the bones scattered like pale memories around the lake's edge. But time has a way of catching up with mysteries. Technology advances, questions sharpen, and what was once a story told only in legend and rumor began to draw the attention of a new generation of scientists, men and women equipped with tools the earlier researchers could not even imagine. By the early 2000s, Roopkund was no longer a local curiosity, it had become an international enigma. Archaeologists, geneticists, and climatologists began proposing expeditions, each driven by a desire to uncover the truth that had eluded their predecessors. The harsh terrain, unpredictable storms, and the lake's near inaccessible location meant that only a few were brave enough to try. But where determination exists, the mountains sometimes allow passage. In 2004, a multidisciplinary team arrived at Roopkund with cutting-edge equipment. They brought DNA extraction kits, high-resolution digital tools, and sample preservation methods designed to keep ancient material intact. Their goal was simple in concept, but monumental in execution: to solve the biological identities of the skeletons. The lake greeted them with its usual silence. The water, cold and opaque, reflected the clouds with a silver sheen. Bones still lay scattered along the shore like the remains of a forgotten battlefield. A few skulls stared skyward with hollow eyes, their fractures still visible despite decades of exposure. Yet this time, the researchers were prepared. They carefully selected samples, fragments of bone and teeth mostly, from skeletons spaced widely apart. If they wanted to determine whether the victims belonged to a single group or several, they needed data from across the entire site. Teeth, in particular, were prized. Their enamel often holds DNA far longer than other parts of the body. Over days of painstaking collection, the team wrapped each sample in sterile packaging, numbering them meticulously as the wind howled around the cliffs like a guardian spirit observing their every move. The cold seemed to seep into their bones as they worked, but the scientists pressed on, driven by the weight of history.
When they finally descended the mountain, carrying their precious samples, they carried something else too: a feeling, a sensation that the lake had allowed them to take what they needed, but only what it permitted. More than one researcher admitted later that they felt watched during the entire expedition, not by animals, not by people, but by the mountain itself. Months passed. The samples traveled from labs across India to international facilities specializing in ancient DNA. Extraction was difficult. The high-altitude climate had preserved the bones, but the centuries of exposure had still done their damage. Many samples yielded only fragments of genetic material, but in the fragments lay truth. When the first test results arrived, they shocked every scientist involved. The dead of Roopkund did not form a single group, nor were they from the same era. The earliest DNA findings revealed two distinct genetic populations, one clearly South Asian, consistent with local populations from centuries past, but the other group defied every expectation. The second genetic cluster was Mediterranean. Not vaguely Mediterranean, not distantly related, direct, clear, precise. Some of the individuals at Roopkund had DNA matching populations from Greece, Crete, and other regions around the eastern Mediterranean basin. Their ancestry was unmistakable. They were not Indian. They were not Asian. They were foreigners, people who had traveled from thousands of kilometers away, from lands across seas and continents. The scientists stared at the results in disbelief. It made no sense. How could Mediterranean individuals, men and women, be present at a remote Himalayan lake at an altitude where even seasoned climbers struggled?
There were no historical records of travelers from the Mediterranean journeying to the Indian Himalayas during the centuries these people lived. No known trade route led here. No pilgrimage path connected these distant cultures. And even if such a journey existed, why would they bring elderly individuals, women, perhaps even children, to a death-trap basin surrounded by cliffs? Skeptics in the scientific community questioned the data. They asked for retesting, verification, independent confirmation. And the results were confirmed again, and again, and again. 2 distinct groups had died at Roopkund, one of South Asian origin, likely pilgrims or locals from the 9th century, and another from the 17th or 18th century carrying Mediterranean genetic signatures. The revelation was explosive.
Suddenly, the mystery grew deeper. The earliest group at Roopkund matched the local legends of a doomed entourage, though the timeline differed from the folklore. But the second group raised 1,000 unanswered questions. Who were they? Why had they traveled to the Himalayas? And why had their journey ended in the same cursed valley as travelers centuries before? The scientists began revisiting the artifacts found earlier. Wooden staffs, rings, beads, leather footwear stitched with patterns unfamiliar in India. Were these the belongings of the Mediterranean group? The discovery cast every object in a new light. Even some fragments of clothing once dismissed as modern litter now seemed significant. A few pieces appeared to contain European weaving techniques. The researchers dove deeper. Radiocarbon dating was performed on both sets of skeletons. The dates reinforced the DNA evidence. The South Asian group had died around 800 to 900 CE. The Mediterranean group, astonishingly, had died nearly 1,000 years later, around the 1600s or 1700s. And yet, the skull injuries, the patterns of death, the scattering of bodies, all were nearly identical. It was as if time itself had repeated the same tragedy. Again, the sky had struck. Again, the mountain had claimed its dead. Again, a storm had fallen with terrifying precision. The idea seemed almost supernatural, but the scientists were not content with mystery. They wanted explanation. They needed to understand. And so they turned to climatologists and geologists, the next frontier of analysis. What kind of storm could be so violent, so deadly, that it killed both groups centuries apart with the same brutal injuries? Before those results would reveal their own astonishing truths, the geneticists released their findings to the world. The media erupted. Headlines called Roopkund the Himalayan lake of Mediterranean skeletons. Documentaries were filmed. Scholars debated in conferences and journals. Tourists poured in, despite warnings from locals and environmentalists. And the villagers, who had long spoken of a curse or divine punishment, felt both vindicated and troubled. The lake's story was no longer theirs alone. It had become a global mystery.
But amid all the frenzy, the DNA secrets uncovered one more chilling truth. The Mediterranean individuals were not related to one another. They were not a family group, not traders, not explorers. Their genetic signatures were diverse, suggesting they had gathered together from various nations around the Mediterranean. But why? What had united them? What had drawn them to this remote and perilous place? The scientists could not answer. And deep in the mountains, the lake remained silent, its surface cold and still, as if watching the world struggle to understand the truth it had guarded for centuries. Roopkund had revealed its first secret, but the dead still had many more stories to tell. The revelation of Mediterranean DNA from bodies found at Roopkund rippled through the scientific world like a shiver running down a giant spine.
For decades, researchers had believed the mystery was confined to the Indian subcontinent, a tragic story of pilgrims cut down by an ancient storm. But now, suddenly, the mystery crossed oceans. It spanned continents, and the bones whispered of travelers whose origins lay far beyond the boundaries of any Himalayan tale. Who were these people? Why had they come? And why had they died here, in a valley so remote and so perilous that even today it challenges experienced climbers? The answers did not come easily, and as scientists searched for clues in archives, maps, folklore, and the bones themselves, the story of these foreign travelers began to take shape, not as a clear linear tale, but as a mosaic scattered across time. The Mediterranean group was unlike anything expected on the roof of the world. Their physical characteristics alone set them apart. Taller than the earlier South Asian group, with skeletal proportions unmistakably linked to populations near the Aegean Sea. Their DNA pointed toward mixed ancestry, some from the Greek islands, others from mainland Greece, a few possibly from the Levant or eastern Mediterranean coast. They were not a single lineage. They were individuals from different families, different cities, perhaps even different cultures. Yet they had traveled together.
The researchers studying these genetic profiles began to speculate. In the 17th to 18th centuries, Europe was a hive of religious movements, trade expansions, maritime exploration, and strange fascinations with the so-called mystical East. Travel diaries from Europeans of that era often described India as a land of holy mountains, magical plants, divine pilgrimage circuits, and ancient pathways leading toward heaven. Many travelers came seeking wisdom, spiritual enlightenment, cures for ailments, or simply adventure. Could the Roopkund foreigners have been such seekers? Maybe, but then why had they chosen a route no European record mentioned? Why had they climbed into terrain so brutal that even Royal Indian expeditions often turned back? Europeans during that period stuck to known trade routes, not uncharted passes above 16,000 feet. Even stranger, the Mediterranean individuals did not appear to be armed or equipped like explorers. Their belongings, those few that survived centuries of ice, were not the tools of adventurers. They were ordinary items. Simple wooden staffs, beads, basic footwear, stitched garments, and a few iron rings. There was no treasure, no relics, no journals, no maps, no navigational instruments, nothing to explain why they were there. This group resembled a pilgrimage more than an expedition. But what pilgrimage could possibly bring foreigners from the Mediterranean to a hidden lake in the Himalayas? Historians struggled to find answers. Some pointed to the 17th century fascination with Indian mysticism among European travelers. Others suggested that the group could have been part of a larger migration or spiritual sect, perhaps a community seeking sacred geography. Others proposed that they were envoys, traders, or diplomats who had strayed far from their intended path. But nothing matched. Nothing explained the presence of Mediterranean men and women at a remote lake with no apparent strategic or religious significance, at least not to their cultures. Then came a detail that intrigued researchers even more. The Mediterranean group had traveled with women. And not just young women, some skeletons belonged to middle-aged or older individuals. This contradicted most theories of exploratory or diplomatic missions. Those were always male-dominated, especially in high-risk regions. This group was not on official business.
Nor were they a military party. Nor were they usual pilgrims. They were something else, something undefined, perhaps deliberately so. To complicate matters further, the remains of the Mediterranean individuals did not show signs of malnutrition or chronic illness. They were healthy, strong. Their bones suggested physical activity, but not the punishing labor of mountain travel. It appeared they had not lived in hardship before their journey.
They were not refugees fleeing persecution, as some theories suggested. The nature of their injuries, identical to those of the earlier group, told the same story. They had been killed instantly, violently, by impacts to the skull. Death came suddenly, without time for fear, without time for escape. Just like the South Asian group 9 centuries before them. 2 groups, 2 different eras, 2 different worlds. Yet both met the same fate. Slowly, researchers began to entertain an idea so unsettling that many dismissed it outright. Roopkund was not simply the site of a single ancient tragedy. It was a repeating phenomenon, a place where nature, or something beyond nature, unleashed catastrophic force on unsuspecting travelers. The villagers had spoken of a curse, of a goddess who punished the arrogant, of dancers and musicians crushed by hail. But such a story did not explain the Mediterranean group. They did not know the legend. They did not follow the pilgrimage. They were strangers, unfamiliar with the landscape and its dangers. And yet, the mountain had taken them too. Were they drawn there unknowingly? Had they been following a guide who misunderstood the terrain? Had a local or foreign mystic convinced them of a hidden pilgrimage route? Or had they stumbled onto the lake by accident, lost in the fog, wandering upward when they should have turned back? Perhaps they were searching for something, but if so, the mountain had not allowed them to find it.
One particularly intriguing theory suggested the Mediterranean travelers might have been part of a cult or secret spiritual movement. The 17th and 18th centuries saw the rise of esoteric groups seeking enlightenment in remote corners of the world: Persian Sufi wanderers, Mediterranean mystics, Greek spiritualists, communities seeking the navel of the universe, a place believed to connect the human soul with divine mountains. But even if this were true, it still did not explain why they traveled where they did. Other theories grew stranger. Some researchers believed the foreigners might have joined an Indian pilgrimage, having heard stories of the power and sanctity of the Himalayas. There were records, though rare, of Europeans joining Indian holy journeys, but none described anything close to the treacherous path leading to Roopkund. The most eerie theory suggested that the Mediterranean group had been manipulated or deceived, perhaps misled by a charismatic leader or guide who believed the lake held ancient power. But no artifacts hinted at such a figure. No bones were found that seemed out of place or arranged differently. Whatever brought the group to the lake, they had arrived as equals, united, unknowingly, in their final destination. Still, the strangest detail of all was yet to come. When isotopic analysis was performed on the Mediterranean skeletons, researchers discovered that their diet had included foods from coastal environments: fish, olives, wheat grains commonly grown near the Mediterranean Sea. This meant they had traveled recently before their deaths. They had not settled in India. They had not lived long in the subcontinent. They were fresh arrivals, strangers to the land around them. Which begged the most troubling question of all. How did they climb so high, so deep into the Himalayas without a trace in any historical record? No letters, no journals, no reports from Indian officials, no documents in Europe describing such a journey. It was as though they had walked into the mountains through a door no one else could see, and the mountains had closed the door behind them forever. In the labs, scientists stared at their data, debating possibilities that bordered on unbelievable. But in the villages below Roopkund, elders shook their heads knowingly when they heard of the foreign bones. Those who come here without the mountain's blessing, they said, meet the same fate, no matter where they are from.
The mountain judges all the same. And perhaps in some ancient way they were right. Because whether pilgrim or stranger, king or wanderer, Indian or foreigner, the moment they entered the valley of Roopkund, they stepped into a place where the earth kept its own laws, a place where storms obeyed no human logic, a place where history repeated itself again and again, yet left no survivors to tell the story. The Mediterranean group had joined the long lineage of the lake's dead. And the deeper scientists dug into their origins, the clearer it became that their presence was not an answer. It was another question, one that would lead to an even stranger revelation, hidden not in the bones, but in the sky itself. For all the mystery surrounding Roopkund, its bones, its legends, its foreigners who vanished into the mountains, one element remained constant in both folklore and science: the storm. A storm so violent, so sudden, so unforgiving that it tore life away in an instant. The villagers blamed the goddess. Early anthropologists blamed a natural disaster. Modern researchers blamed an anomaly in the sky. But none of them had truly understood what the mountain was capable of. Until now.
As the DNA results startled the world, a team of climatologists began piecing together evidence that earlier researchers had overlooked. They traveled with instruments capable of reading atmospheric memory, computer models that reconstructed ancient weather patterns, chemical analyses that revealed the fingerprints of storms centuries old, and satellite imagery that captured the strange, swirling behavior of clouds around the Himalayas. These tools, combined with the skeletal injuries, began forming a picture of that catastrophic moment in time. It started with ice.
Not the gentle hailstones familiar to monsoon rains in the plains. No, this hail was monstrous, solid, heavy, forged in the high altitudes where winds screamed and clouds collided in chaos. The climatologists began by studying the terrain around Roopkund. The lake sits like a hollow in a stone bowl, surrounded by ridges so sharp they seem carved by spears of ice. That bowl shape, they realized, could trap cold air, forcing upward winds to spiral. When storm clouds drifted into the basin, the unusual shape of the valley could magnify their power. The winds would spin like a funnel, thickening the clouds, cooling them rapidly. And then the impossible could happen. Snow crystals formed, growing layer upon layer as they were tossed around violently in the circular wind patterns. The drafts inside the storm kept the hailstones afloat, growing heavier, harder, deadlier. In most regions of the world, such monstrous hailstones would fall apart before reaching the ground. But the altitude of Roopkund, more than 16,000 feet above sea level, meant the frozen projectiles had little time to melt. Some climatologists believe these hailstones could have weighed nearly a kilogram each. A kilogram of solid ice falling from the sky. A weapon. A rain of death. This theory explained the fractures on the skulls so perfectly that it silenced even the skeptics. The round, deep dents, the pattern of injuries, the lack of defensive wounds, the way bodies had collapsed instantly where they stood. The storm had offered no warning, no time to hide beneath trees or boulders.
Many of the victims likely fell to the ground within seconds, stunned or already dying. The storm was not a punishment. It was a force of nature so violent that ancient people could only interpret it as divine wrath.
But understanding the storm was only part of the story. The researchers needed to know when these catastrophic events occurred. They collected sediment samples from the lake bed, thin layers of mud, silt, and pollen preserved under the cold water. Each layer represented a year. Some layers revealed signs of severe runoff, suggesting sudden flooding caused by extreme rainfall or melting hail. Others showed unusual chemical signatures, spikes in mineral content that matched the aftermath of violent storms. When they analyzed the layers corresponding to the 9th century and the 17th century, the two time periods indicated by the DNA, they found identical patterns of disturbance. Two storms, one nearly 1,000 years before the other. Two catastrophes, separated by time, but identical in violence. It was as if Roopkund existed in a pocket where nature repeated itself, striking with precision every few centuries. The scientists began reconstructing what each event might have looked like. The first storm, around 800–900 CE, likely took place during a pilgrimage or a mountain crossing. A group of South Asian travelers, men, women, elders, perhaps following a sacred route, found themselves on open ground. Their clothing, footwear, and belongings suggested they were not accustomed to extreme elevations. When the sky darkened, they might have believed a simple rain was coming. But the mountain had different plans. The temperature dropped quickly. Winds howled. A cloud, black and violent, descended into the basin. Hailstones began to fall, not gently, not sporadically, but in a barrage. A downpour of icy missiles slamming into skulls, shoulders, arms. Panic erupted. People ran. They attempted to shield themselves with their hands, their scarves, their bags, but nothing helped. The hailstones were too heavy, too fast, too lethal. Within minutes, it was over. The victims lay scattered, bleeding into the snow, their bodies rigid with cold. The second storm, nearly 1,000 years later, was no different. The Mediterranean group, unfamiliar with the Himalayas, likely trusted a guide or believed they were on a safe path. They may have been heading toward a sacred place or simply traveling in awe of the mountains. But when the sky shifted, when those swirling black clouds gathered above them, their fate was sealed.
The storms were nearly identical in strength and behavior. This coincidence led researchers to uncover something even stranger. The Roopkund Basin lies in a rare microclimate zone, where atmospheric pressure, wind currents, and valley topography can create what is known as a mesoscale convective vortex. These small, intense storm cells can form very quickly and with little warning. In most parts of the world, such patterns dissipate harmlessly. But at Roopkund, where the topography forms a natural trap, they concentrate instead of dispersing. The mountain does not produce storms, it harvests them. As climatologists presented their findings, a new understanding emerged, one that wove science and legend together in a seamless, unsettling way. The mountain goddess of local lore, Nanda Devi, was not a supernatural punisher. She was the personification of a deadly, unpredictable climate phenomenon. Ancient villagers, observing the destruction left behind by these freak storms, interpreted them through the lens of spiritual belief. They were not wrong. They simply described in story what science would describe in models. But even with this explanation, one question remained. Why did these storms strike only when large groups attempted to cross the basin? Why did individuals or small parties who visited the area in modern times not meet the same fate? Was it coincidence? Or did the storms form only under certain atmospheric conditions, conditions present centuries ago but rare today due to shifting climate patterns? As the researchers dug deeper, they discovered more unsettling evidence. Some ancient sediments seemed to suggest that the storms of Roopkund were growing less frequent. The climate had changed. The world had warmed. The mountain, in some strange way, was becoming less dangerous. And yet, as they stood at the lake's edge on their final day of fieldwork, the wind picked up. A low rumble echoed from a distant ridge. Clouds formed above the valley, swirling slowly, almost deliberately.
One of the scientists, Dr. Mira Sen, felt her skin prickle. "The mountain remembers," she whispered, "even if we forget." The sky did not open that day. No storm fell, no hailstones crashed upon them, but the clouds lingered, thick, heavy, ominous, before eventually drifting away. If the lake had a voice, it remained silent. If the mountain had a warning, it remained unspoken. But the truth, revealed by science, was clear all the same. The dead of Roopkund had not been killed by myth. They had been killed by the sky itself. And the sky, at Roopkund, was capable of horrors no human story could ever fully capture. There are places in the world where time behaves strangely, where the past lingers like breath in cold air, where the voices of the dead mingle with the wind, and where the earth itself seems unwilling to let stories fade. Roopkund is one such place, a lake in the clouds, a bowl of wind and silence, a valley where centuries collapse into a single eternal moment. This chapter is not about bones or data or scientific theories. It is about people. The men, women, children, elders, the living souls who took their final steps toward the lake unaware they were walking into a storm that would swallow them into legend. Their last moments are not recorded in any document, but the clues carved into their bones, the objects found beside them, and the reconstructed weather patterns allow us to imagine, vividly, painfully, how they died. And in doing so, we honor the humanity behind the mystery. Let us return to the 9th century first. A group of South Asian travelers, likely pilgrims, trekked across the steep ridges and narrow trails. They carried offerings for the goddess Nanda Devi, perhaps flowers, rice, bells, and sacred cloths. Their clothes were woolen, their sandals leather-bound. Some carried staves carved with symbols, others carried little at all. Among them were women wearing beads woven into their hair and elderly individuals supported by younger companions.
They were tired. The altitude had thinned the air, the cold bit at their fingers. Yet they pressed forward because the pilgrimage was sacred. Each step was a prayer. The morning sky had been clear when they started, but as they climbed higher, clouds began to gather silently, creeping across the ridges like shadows stretching their fingers. A wind picked up, sharp and sudden, stinging their cheeks. The pilgrims noticed, but they were used to mountain moods. They tightened their shawls and continued. Then the first rumble rolled across the sky, low and guttural, a sound like something ancient waking from sleep. The group paused. One of the priests whispered a prayer. But the sky had already decided their fate. The clouds darkened rapidly, collapsing toward the valley in a spiraling mass. Thunder cracked, splitting the air like a whip. The pilgrims huddled together, looking for shelter, but the cliffs offered none. Roopkund Basin was too exposed, too open, too vulnerable.
And then the hail began. Small at first, little stones bouncing harmlessly off shoulders and heads, the pilgrims flinched, but continued to shield themselves with bags and scarves. But the hail grew. Faster, harder, larger. Pieces of ice the size of fists, then apples, then something far more deadly. Cries filled the valley as skulls cracked beneath the falling ice. A woman screamed as a hailstone struck her shoulder, dislocating it instantly. A child dropped to his knees, arms raised in instinctive protection. The priests tried to shield the queen's attendants, but the hail was merciless. Some ran downhill, only to slip on the quickly icing ground and fall. Others tried to crawl beneath small outcroppings of rock, but the hailstones were too large. They ricocheted off stone, striking from cruel angles. One man attempted to cover an elderly pilgrim with his shawl, only for both to collapse as the ice broke their skulls simultaneously. The sound of hail striking bone echoed across the basin. The storm lasted minutes, long enough to kill, short enough to leave behind silence that felt like the aftermath of war. The clouds withdrew as swiftly as they had appeared, drifting across the mountains as if indifferent to the devastation they had wrought. And when the sun emerged, its light fell upon bodies sprawled in contorted positions, arms outstretched, fingers curled, lips frozen mid-cry.
No one survived to carry their story down the mountain. Their bones waited for a millennium, and then, centuries later, the Mediterranean group arrived. Their last journey began differently. Perhaps they had heard of a sacred site hidden in the high mountains. Perhaps a guide promised them a place of enlightenment, or perhaps they followed a rumor, a whisper from traders or mystics describing a lake of divine beauty. Whatever led them, their clothing made one thing clear. They were not prepared for what awaited them. Some wore soft leather shoes suitable for coastal terrain. Others had cloaks made of linen or wool too thin for Himalayan cold. Their staffs, though sturdy, were not built for mountain ice. Still, they climbed, perhaps driven by curiosity, devotion, or the desire for a spiritual experience. Their journey took place in warmer centuries, during a time when global temperatures were slightly lower and Himalayan storms more unpredictable. The sky may have been deceptively calm as they approached the basin. Some likely marveled at the lake's crystal surface, unaware of the bones already hidden beneath it. Then, the wind changed. A sudden gust swept down the cliffs, swirling dust across their path. The temperature plummeted. Some travelers pulled their cloaks tighter, glancing nervously at the horizon. But before they could prepare, the storm descended. The Mediterranean travelers, unused to such rapid weather shifts, panicked first. The sky opened, not with rain, not with snow, but with ice. And not the small hail they may have known from their homelands. These were weapons, heavy, merciless, falling with the speed of a dropped stone. A woman screamed as a hailstone struck her spine, knocking her face first into the earth. A man raised his arms to protect his head, only for the next chunk of ice to break both forearms and smash through his skull. A younger traveler tried to leap behind a rock, but slipped, the ice shattering his jaw before he could stand again. Some attempted to flee back up the slope, desperate for higher ground. But the hailstones fell even harder there, hitting with such force that one traveler's skull was crushed instantly, the sound echoing like an axe striking wood.
Others huddled together, believing their bodies could shield one another. But the hail was too large. It tore through their defenses, hammering them into the ground. Within minutes, it was over. Silence returned to the mountains. When the clouds drifted away, the storm had left the foreigners unrecognizable. Lifeless figures sprawled beside their South Asian predecessors, separated by nearly 1,000 years, yet united by the same brutal fate. The lake, indifferent to time, watched over them. Centuries later, when modern researchers examined the skeletons, they found the Mediterranean group's injuries identical to those of the earlier pilgrims. The fractures told the story of an event too violent to imagine without witnessing it. The bones carried the imprint of the sky's fury. In that shared silence after the storm, both groups, ancient Indians and Mediterranean travelers, lay together as though the mountain had woven their destinies into a single tapestry. One question haunted every scientist who studied their remains. Did the victims realize, even in their final seconds, that something impossible was happening? That the sky was falling upon them with the force of 1,000 stones? Did they feel fear, shock, confusion, or was it over too quickly to understand? We will never know. But their last moments were neither peaceful nor expected. They died not from disease or violence inflicted by others, but from the raw and unpredictable power of nature. Their final breaths were taken beneath a sky that betrayed them. Their final steps led them to a lake that would hold their memory longer than any living witness. Their final cries were swallowed by the wind, carried across centuries, arriving in our time as whispers woven into the bones at the bottom of Roopkund. The dead cannot speak, but through their last moments, reconstructed in fragments, in fractures, and broken ancient silence, they tell a story both tragic and awe-inspiring. Roopkund is not just a place. It is a moment suspended in time, a moment of terror, a moment of fate, a moment that repeats across centuries, claiming those who wander too close to the heart of the storm.
Roopkund may be small, only a shallow basin frozen most of the year, but it is a treasury of secrets. A vault where time slows, where decay hesitates, and where relics of human tragedy wait patiently beneath layers of ice. While the bones tell the story of death, the objects found beside them tell the story of life. Who these people were, what they carried, what they valued, what they feared, and what they hoped for before the storm claimed them. As researchers returned to the lake again and again, each expedition uncovered fragments of existence, preserved with uncanny precision. It was as though the mountain itself had held the belongings in cold palms, refusing to let them vanish. The thin Himalayan air, the freezing temperatures, the seasonal ice, all combined to create a natural crypt, a place where fabric survived centuries and wood defied rot. The lake did not just contain skeletons, it contained memories. The first artifacts recovered belonged to the older South Asian group. Their items told stories of pilgrimage rather than warfare or exploration. Leather sandals, some reinforced with iron nails, were scattered around the basin, their shapes distorted by age but unmistakable in design. Some sandals were small, belonging to children or petite women. Others bore signs of long journeys, frayed straps, soles worn thin by miles of rocky paths. Near these sandals were wooden staffs, smooth from countless hours of being gripped. A few had carvings, lines spiraling like sacred symbols, or dots arranged in patterns that may have held meaning now lost to time. One staff, in particular, discovered half buried near the lake's edge,
bore an intricately carved head resembling a mythical creature, perhaps an offering to the goddess Nanda Devi. Its design was too detailed to belong to an ordinary traveler. It suggested someone of importance, someone who believed deeply in the sanctity of the journey. Even more revealing were the small metal objects scattered among the rocks: bronze rings, iron bangles, beads made from bone and stone. Some of these items were simple. Others were ornate, the kind of jewelry worn by pilgrims who wished to honor the goddess with their best attire. But their presence also suggested that the group was not impoverished. They traveled with purpose and with pride. Fragments of cloth were also found, preserved in ice. Strands of wool dyed in red and yellow. A few pieces of embroidered fabric believed to be part of ceremonial garments. A scrap of cloth with thread patterns resembling those used in 9th century Himalayan communities. Perhaps these were shawls, perhaps ceremonial sashes. No one could say for certain.
But they spoke of culture, tradition, and belief. The South Asian group had come willingly, their journey steeped in ritual. Their death, sudden as it was, had not erased who they were. The Mediterranean group left behind an entirely different world of artifacts. Their belongings stood out not just in design, but in materials unfamiliar to the region. Their footwear was crafted from fine leather, soft, flexible, stitched in patterns not found in local craftsmanship. Their clothing contained weaving techniques common in the Eastern Mediterranean: linen blends, wool spun into tight decorative threads, pieces of fabric dyed with colors more common near the coasts of Greece or Crete. One of the most striking discoveries was a wooden vessel, beautifully carved with geometric patterns typical of Aegean craftsmanship. It was not entirely intact, cracked by centuries of cold, but enough remained to recognize its origin. Why would Mediterranean travelers carry such an object up the Himalayas? Was it ceremonial, a gift, a relic from home carried for spiritual comfort? Another artifact puzzled researchers even more: a small, flat disc of metal with a hole in the center, similar to a pendant or protective charm. But its engravings did not match Indian designs. Instead, the markings resembled symbols used in early Mediterranean maritime cultures. Did someone believe this charm would protect them, even in the Himalayas? Or was it a keepsake from home, a reminder of a faraway sea? Climatologists and archaeologists continued to search, carefully scanning the lake bed with sonar, extracting sediment cores and combing the shoreline. Each discovery added another line to the story. Some travelers had carried leather bags filled with millet or barley. Others had pouches containing medicinal herbs, mint, resin, and dried leaves. These suggested the Mediterranean group had prepared for a long journey, but not for this journey, not for the brutality of the high mountains. One of the most haunting finds emerged during an expedition in the early 2010s: remnants of a wooden flute. Its shape was fractured, but the finger holes and carved mouthpiece remained clear, a simple instrument, a quiet companion on a long journey. The thought that music might have drifted through the Himalayan air moments or hours before death gave the discovery an almost unbearable poignancy. The dead of Roopkund were not faceless. They were travelers with lives, voices, songs, and the mountain had preserved the last notes of their stories. Even tools provided clues: small iron knives, sharp but lightweight. Not weapons, but tools for cutting food or preparing camp. Their size suggested a peaceful journey. No swords, no shields, no signs of conflict among them. They did not expect danger. They did not anticipate violence. They carried the items of wanderers,
not warriors.
As more artifacts surfaced, trends became undeniable. The South Asian group had walked a spiritual path. The Mediterranean group had walked an unfamiliar one, but both had been swallowed by the same fate. Perhaps the most telling artifacts were the footwear discoveries. Modern climbers visiting the lake often marveled at these ancient shoes, perfectly preserved by ice. Some were soft-soled, some reinforced. But most were inadequate for the brutal climb. No crampons, no thick insulation, no proper soles for icy terrain. It reinforced a chilling truth. Neither group understood the danger of the land they crossed. In their final hours, what had their last possessions meant to them? A ring worn for luck, a staff meant to steady them on the path, a shawl wrapped tightly against the cold, a flute carried for comfort, a charm from home, a bundle of herbs meant to ease pains. None of these protected them from what fell from the sky. And yet, after their deaths, these objects became their voices. They became the threads that connected present to past. They became evidence of their identity, evidence that regardless of where they came from, they were human beings with hopes and beliefs and stories that deserved to be remembered. The lake revealed something else too, something beyond objects. It revealed stillness. Bodies that fell where they stood, bones that settled into the soil in natural positions, untouched by predators. A lake so cold that even the passing of centuries could not strip it of its secrets. The mud at the bottom held layers of pollen that told of shifting climates. The water held chemical traces of ancient storms. The stones bore imprints of fragments that once belonged to sandals, bags, or bowls. Nothing vanished. Everything lingered. It was as though Roopkund refused to let go of the truth.
But even as researchers pieced together the artifacts, questions still lingered in the thin, frigid air. Why had the Mediterranean travelers come so far? Why had two groups from different centuries and different worlds met the same fate at the same lake? Why did the mountain keep their belongings so intact, as if preserving them for discovery? And perhaps the most haunting question, what else was the lake still hiding beneath its frozen heart? The answers would not come easily. Roopkund had given the world clues, beautiful, tragic, miraculous clues, but it had not given the full story. Not yet. For every mystery Roopkund has revealed, it has birthed two more. The lake's silence is deceptive. It lures the curious with its strange clarity, then blinds them with a deeper fog of questions. Scientists, historians, mountaineers, and mystics alike have tried to understand its secrets, yet the truth remains suspended in the thin Himalayan air, always just out of reach. Even after decades of research and cutting-edge technology, many questions haunt the lake like restless spirits. Why did two unrelated groups, separated by centuries, languages, cultures, and continents, die in the exact same place? Why is there no historical record from either era describing such a tragedy? And why does Roopkund, of all places, preserve its dead so faithfully, as if refusing to let time erase their stories? These questions echo louder today than ever before. The first unanswered question concerns the Mediterranean travelers. Their very presence in such a remote, treacherous place has baffled historians. There is no recorded event in the 17th or 18th centuries describing a foreign expedition deep into the Himalayas. No ship's logs mention such a mission. No European diaries hint at it. No Indian chronicles describe meeting these outsiders. It is as if the Mediterranean group left no trace in the world except their bones.
Some scholars have suggested lost documents, records that never survived. Fires, wars, and decay have erased countless pages of history. Perhaps the Mediterranean group belonged to a small sect or community whose writings were never widely circulated. Perhaps they were pilgrims following an obscure spiritual guide. But even then, for them to travel so far, so high, and so deep into unknown terrain without leaving a ripple in history is almost unimaginable.
Another theory suggests secrecy. Perhaps this expedition was meant to be hidden, an elite spiritual undertaking, or even an esoteric mission. The presence of women and elders complicates this theory, but some ancient sects believed enlightenment required crossing dangerous landscapes as a test of faith. If this group sought a sacred mountain or mythical lake, they could have been misled. Or perhaps they reached exactly where they intended, only to meet a fate no one could predict. Their diversity also raises questions. DNA revealed that they were not a family group, not people from one village or city, but individuals from different Mediterranean regions. What bound them together? Who brought them? And who led them across thousands of kilometers of land and sea to Roopkund? Their journey feels deliberate, yet inexplicable. The second major question concerns the South Asian group from the 9th century. Though local folklore seems to refer to them, the details do not align perfectly. The legend speaks of a royal entourage, dancers, a pregnant queen, and divine punishment, but the scientific evidence suggests something less grand, more modest, pilgrims on a sacred journey, not nobles traveling with pomp and ceremony. And yet, the presence of ornate artifacts, carved staffs, and jewelry suggests status among some individuals. Could the legend of the Queen be a distorted retelling of a real tragedy? Did the story grow with time, adding dramatized elements, transforming pilgrims into royals? Or was the pilgrimage truly led by someone of importance whose name and life were consumed by the chaos of history? If so, why is there no written record? Why did no chronicler preserve the tale? A tragedy of dozens, perhaps hundreds, should have left its imprint in scriptures, local texts, temple archives, or at least oral traditions more detailed than the broad legend we know today. Instead, we have a whisper where there should be a voice. Another question looms even larger. Why were the storms so selective? Why did they strike with such perfect lethality when these groups arrived? Why not before? Why not after? Modern climbers have passed by the lake for decades without facing such deadly hail. The storms appear in the sediment record, but seem exceedingly rare.
Were the victims simply unlucky? Or was there something about traveling in large groups that triggered a dangerous atmospheric reaction, perhaps stirring microclimates in ways modern weather no longer allows? Climate scientists note that climate conditions centuries ago were colder and more volatile. The storms of the past may have been capable of destruction far beyond what we know today. But even knowing this, the symmetry of the tragedies remains eerie. Two deadly storms, nearly 1,000 years apart, striking in the exact same killing ground. Coincidence? Or a pattern nature hides too well for us to see? Then there is the lake itself, the way it holds on to the dead. Most mountain environments destroy organic material quickly. Scavengers, snowmelt, landslides, erosion. These forces erase traces within years. But Roopkund is different. It is a natural time capsule. The wind sweeps debris toward the center. The cold prevents decay. The annual freezing and thawing shift bones only slightly, never enough to destroy them. It is as if the lake preserves death by design. The bones lie there in perfect silence, arranged by nothing but nature yet resembling something intentionally curated, as though the mountain is saying, "Look, do not forget. This happened." The lack of written accounts adds to the mystery. The Himalayas have long been hubs of spiritual activity. Countless pilgrims have crossed them, and many left behind detailed histories. Yet Roopkund went unmentioned in sacred texts. Temples nearby never recorded the tragedies. No tales passed down describe a storm so violent it wiped out entire groups. Instead, Roopkund became a shadow in the periphery of memory, known only through a vague legend and the warnings of villagers who avoided it. Why? Were the tragedies too traumatic to retell? Too shameful? Too sacred? Or were they simply forgotten, lost like so many stories swallowed by time?
Even stranger, the Mediterranean group's presence raises questions that venture into the realm of the uncanny. Did they choose Roopkund, or did Roopkund choose them? Did they seek the lake, or were they drawn to it by accident, fate, or misdirection? Was their arrival guided by human hands or by something far older? Some researchers speak cautiously about magnetic landscapes, places on Earth that pull travelers in through myth, geography, or intuition. The Himalayas are full of such places, valleys where compasses falter, trails that redirect wanderers, ridges where sound behaves strangely. Could Roopkund be one of these places, a point where the natural world shapes the path of those who cross it? These interpretations tread close to mysticism, yet even the most rational scientists admit that Roopkund exerts an unusual psychological pull. Climbers describe feeling watched. Some hikers feel compelled to look back repeatedly, as if expecting to see someone behind them. Others report strange dreams after camping nearby. Tools malfunction, batteries drain faster, the wind seems to whisper. None of this is written in scientific papers, but the people who've been there remember. And then there is the final unanswered question, the one that lingers beneath all others. Are there more bones? More groups? More stories hidden beneath the lake, waiting to be exposed by a future thaw? Climate change has already begun to melt parts of the lake earlier in the year, revealing new remains. What happens when the ice recedes further? What long-buried truth will rise from the water next? Roopkund is not finished speaking. Its mystery is not solved. It is merely unfolding, layer by layer, question by question, like the peeling of ancient ice from ancient bone. And though scientists and historians continue to search for definitive answers, one thing is certain. Roopkund does not reveal everything at once. It reveals only what the mountain allows. Its secrets remain scattered between the stories of the living and the silence of the dead, waiting for the moment when the world is ready to hear them. If you ever stand on the ridge overlooking Roopkund, if you ever feel the thin breath of the mountain brushing against your skin, you will understand something that photographs and stories cannot capture. You will feel the weight of centuries pressing around you, layers of time stacked like silent spectators. You will feel the cold not only on your face, but deep in your bones, as though the air is reaching inward. And you will sense something else too, something wordless, something ancient. The lake is watching you. It has always watched, long before the British patrol, long before the Mediterranean wanderers, long before the pilgrims who sang prayers to Nanda Devi.
Long before even the first legend was whispered at the firesides of Himalayan villages, Roopkund has been a witness, silent, patient, unmovable. The winds that dance across the basin carry more than cold. They carry memory. They carry warning. They carry the echo of storms that once tore the sky open with merciless force. They carry the faintest whisper of footsteps from travelers who never returned. And if you listen closely, truly listen, you may hear something else hidden between those gusts. A reminder. A reminder of what it means to be human in a world ruled by powers older than our oldest stories. For all our intelligence, all our science, all our ambition, we remain small. A truth that Roopkund displays with blunt honesty. The bones around the lake do not lie. They tell a story of fragility, of vulnerability, of people whose lives were ended not by war or disease, but by the raw might of nature. A single storm claimed them. A single moment shattered everything they carried, everything they believed, everything they hoped for. Yet in death, they have become eternal. Their bones, bleached by sun and snow, lie like pale testimonies on the valley floor. Their belongings, preserved by ice, whisper of lives cut short. Their stories, reconstructed through science and folklore, remind us that history is fragile, that it can vanish for centuries only to reappear when the world is ready to ask the right questions. And perhaps that is Roopkund's greatest mystery, not why these people died, but why they were allowed to be found. For centuries, the lake remained hidden, tucked away at the roof of the world, untouched by chroniclers or kings. Then in the 20th century, as humanity developed the tools to uncover the truth, Roopkund revealed just enough to intrigue us, but not enough to satisfy. It gave us bones. It gave us artifacts. It gave us stories. It gave us clues, but never certainty. Even now, after all the research, all the DNA testing, all the climatic reconstructions, the lake refuses to give a final answer. It offers knowledge in fragments, as if testing our patience.
It tells us, understand this much, but no more. Perhaps the mountain knows that a complete truth would strip away the wonder. Perhaps mystery is part of the story, part of what makes the lake sacred. The unknown forces us to imagine, to question, to contemplate our place in the vast and indifferent world. The villagers understand this better than any scientist. They still tread carefully when climbing near the basin. They still speak of the lake with reverence, as though it were alive. To them, the mountain is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a deity, a guardian, a being older than time itself. They believe the bones are not merely evidence, they are warnings handed down by nature, or by Nanda Devi, or by forces beyond naming. Those who come here without respect, an elder once said, do not return the same. Maybe that is true. Maybe the lake changes those who stand before it. Maybe the weight of so many forgotten lives presses on the soul in ways that cannot be explained. Modern visitors, adventurers, trekkers, researchers often describe a strange stillness upon reaching Roopkund. Some feel awe, some feel fear. Some feel as though they are intruding on a sacred moment frozen in time. A few claim to sense something else entirely, the presence of the dead. Not as ghosts, not as apparitions, but as memories that refuse to fade. And if they feel watched, perhaps they are. Not by spirits, but by history itself. It is easy to imagine the Mediterranean travelers taking their final steps across the basin.
Easy to imagine the pilgrims from the 9th century whispering prayers as dark clouds spiraled above. Easy to imagine the storms forming, massive, swirling vortexes of ice and wind, descending with the fury that would turn these valleys into graves. Their fear, their confusion, their final breaths. These moments are suspended in the landscape, caught like insects in amber, preserved across ages. Roopkund remains unchanged. The world moves forward, the lake stays still. Time destroys cities, Roopkund keeps its secrets. Empires rise and collapse, the bones remain. Perhaps the most haunting truth of Roopkund is not that people died there, but that the mountain held on to them. It did not let them scatter or disappear. It did not let animals carry them away or weather turn them to dust. Instead, it chose to preserve them slowly, carefully, painfully, until humanity was capable of piecing together their story.
Why? No one knows. Some say the mountain wanted to teach a lesson about humility. Some say it wanted to warn future generations. Some say it guards the dead because they never completed their journeys. And some believe the lake watches because it must, because it is the keeper of balance, of life and death in equal measure. As the final rays of sun bleed across the ridges, as the wind picks up and whispers through the valley, as shadows lengthen over the bones, a sense of stillness falls over the basin, a stillness that feels eternal. Roopkund does not forget. Roopkund does not forgive. Roopkund does not explain. It only watches. And perhaps that is all it needs to do. For in watching, it reminds us that some mysteries are meant to remain open, echoing across centuries, challenging our understanding, forcing us to confront the limits of what we know. In watching, it reminds us that death is not the end of a story. Sometimes death is the beginning of one. And in watching, it leaves us with a truth more powerful than any scientific conclusion. The lake holds the dead, but the living carry the story. The wind hums one last time across the basin, carrying with it the voices of those who perished there. And as it drifts down the slopes, into the forests, across the villages, into the world, it whispers a final message: remember us.